Modernism, 1901 to 1922. English literary modernism developed in the early 20th century out of a general sense of disillusionment with Victorian-era attitudes of certainty, conservatism, and belief in the idea of objective truth. The movement was influenced by the ideas of Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, Ernst Mach, 1838 to 1916, Henri Bergson, 1859 to 1941, Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, James G. Fraser, 1854 to 1941, Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, Das Kapital, 1867, and the psychoanalytic theories of Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, among others. The continental art movements of Impressionism, and later Cubism, were also important. Important literary precursors of modernism were Fyodor Dostoevsky, 1821 to 1881, Walt Whitman, 1819 to 1892, Charles Baudelaire, 1821 to 1867, Rimbaud, 1854 to 1891, August Strindberg, 1849 to 1912. A major British lyric poet of the first decades of the 20th century was Thomas Hardy, 1840 to 1928. Though not a modernist, Hardy was an important transitional figure between the Victorian era and the 20th century. A major novelist of the late 19th century, Hardy lived well into the third decade of the 20th century, though he only published poetry in this period. Another significant transitional figure between Victorians and modernists, the late 19th century novelist, Henry James, 1843 to 1916, continued to publish major novels into the 20th century, including The Golden Bowl, 1904. Polish-born modernist novelist Joseph Conrad, 1857 to 1924, published his first important works, Heart of Darkness, in 1899 and Lord Gym in 1900. However, the Victorian Gerard Manley Hopkins's, 1844 to 1889, highly original poetry was not published until 1918, long after his death, while the career of another major modernist poet, Irishman W. B. Yeats, 1865 to 1939, began late in the Victorian era. Yeats was one of the foremost figures of 20th century English literature. But while modernism was to become an important literary movement in the early decades of the new century, there were also many fine writers who, like Thomas Hardy, were not modernists. During the early decades of the 20th century, the Georgian poets like Rupert Brooke, 1887 to 1915, and Walter de la Mare, 1873 to 1956, maintained a conservative approach to poetry by combining romanticism, sentimentality and hedonism. Another Georgian poet, Edward Thomas, 1878 to 1917, is one of the First World War poets along with Wilfred Owen, 1893 to 1918, Rupert Brooke, 1887 to 1915, Isaac Rosenberg, 1890 to 1917, and Siegfried Sassoon, 1886 to 1967. Irish playwrights George Bernard Shaw, 1856 to 1950, J. M. Synge, 1871 to 1909, and Sean O'Casey were influential in British drama. Shaw's career began in the last decade of the 19th century, while Synge's plays belong to the first decade of the 20th century. Synge's most famous play, The Playboy of the Western World, caused outrage and riots when it was first performed in Dublin in 1907. George Bernard Shaw turned the Edwardian theatre into an arena for debate about important political and social issues. Novelists who are not considered modernists include H. G. Wells, 1866 to 1946, John Galsworthy, 1867 to 1933, Nobel Prize in Literature, 1932, whose works include The Forsyte Saga, 1906-21, and E. M. Forster's, 1879 to 1970, though Forster's work is frequently regarded as containing both modernist and Victorian elements. Forster's most famous work, A Passage to India 1924, reflected challenges to imperialism, while his earlier novels examined the restrictions and hypocrisy of Edwardian society in England. The most popular British writer of the early years of the 20th century was arguably Rudyard Kipling, 1865–1936, a highly versatile writer of novels, short stories and poems. In addition to W.B. Yeats, other important early modernist poets were the American-born poet T.S. Eliot, 1888–1965. Eliot became a British citizen in 1927 but was born and educated in America. His most famous works are Prufrock, 1915, The Waste Land, 1922, and Four Quartets, 1935–42. Amongst the novelists, after Joseph Conrad, other important early modernists include Dorothy Richardson, 1873–1957, whose novel Pointed Roof, 1915, is one of the earliest example of the stream of consciousness technique, and D.H. Lawrence, 1885–1930, who published The Rainbow in 1915, though it was immediately seized by the police, and Women in Love in 1920. Then in 1922 Irishman James Joyce's important modernist novel Ulysses appeared. Ulysses has been called a demonstration and summation of the entire movement. Thank you.